Hey there, everyone. Sorry for the long wait between these, but as I said in the last time I did one of these, they take forever to record. That being said, it's also going to take you forever to get through this video, so really kick back, get comfortable, grab yourself a nice big glass of milk, and let's get into it.
Wow.
So as I said in my last Chaos Demons video, I actually hope, maybe don't expect, but hope that CA separates out the Demons of Chaos into their own faction and then just gives us themed monogod armies for each. So today we'll be taking a look at the Nurgle monogod army for the Demons of Chaos, Warriors of Chaos, Beastmen, and Norsca, as well as all the various things that would need to be tweaked and changed for each of those ones. So first things first, let's set a couple ground rules to begin with. Now, before we get into this too deep, I think it's important to take a look at some basic ground rules just to make sure we're being realistic. As much as it would be amazing to request every single named character and every single unit for Nurgle and stuff like that, that's never going to happen. There's just way too much stuff. So for me, what I perceive as being the good sort of compromise would be to take a Legendary Lord pack and just double it exactly across the board. So instead of two factions getting, about 3 units and one Legendary Lord each, you would have four factions getting 3 units and one Legendary Lord each for exactly twice the price. Nice thing about doing it this way though too is even though I said 3 units each, realistically those new 12 units could be split amongst the various factions pretty dang easily, right? It wouldn't be unusual to see something like 6 or 7 units actually ending up on each of the Nurgle themed armies simply because it makes perfect sense for a lot of these units to be shared. However, on the topic of sharing, I still strongly oppose the concept of combining the Demons of Chaos and the Warriors of Chaos, and on a similar token, I also strongly oppose throwing demonic leadership into the mortal factions, just because it makes it feel all less special. So for me, it's going to be one legendary lord for each of the four factions. One's not going to get 2, one's not going to get 0, anything like that. And then the units that I'm going to talk about for each, bearing in mind that they're going to be applied to what makes sense for that faction. So with that said, let's take a first look at sort of a generalized idea of how Nurgle would focus and play. So, at the risk of sounding obvious, Nurgle is obviously very plague focused, and we actually have a plague theme, or not plague theme, we have a plague option already in the game thanks to the Skaven. It definitely needs to be more fleshed out for someone like Nurgle to make an appearance, but of course, that would be their sort of primary means of attacking without actually getting in there. The way I would see it is as the more chaotic corruption exists in your neighbors, the higher the risk that you end up causing a plague over in their cities. Um, Similarly, for your own cities, I would assume that people in Nurgle are usually pretty happy. He's a pretty swell guy as far as chaos gods go. I would assume that keeping your own sort of territories on, like I said, content would probably be a bit easier with Nurgle in play. And of course, you would have severe attrition mechanics for anyone trying to attack your stuff. When it comes to battle, I mean, we'll get into more specific units down the road, but in general, Nurgle is slow but tanky as balls, right? So that would be the general theme for all of his armies going forward. You would have speeds that make it look like your opponent is walking and still outrunning you, and yet when it actually came down into combat, you'd be able to soak up fire left, right, and center and still not break a sweat. Now, before we get into the factions, we need to take a look at what I would hope for the shared pool to be. Full disclosure, some of the stuff would have to be taken off. There's just too much content here. But for the brand new stuff, I would hope to see Great Unclean Ones, Plague Bearers, and Nurglings at the absolute bare minimum, as well as Heralds of Nurgle. I feel like those are strictly necessary. The hope to see for the brand new stuff would be things like Beasts of Nurgle, because they could pull double duty with chariots, as well as the Palanquin and the Rotflies slash Plague Drones of Nurgle. Those being all brand new units with no particular contemporaries, especially the Plague Drones, because they can be used as flying cavalry, which is something that would be sorely lacking in this army. Moving over to units that would effectively be replacements of other units. Like I said, the Chariots of Nurgle would essentially just be Marauder Chariots, but pulled by the Beasts of Nurgles with some different stats. Replacing out your chieftains would be Putrid Blight Kings. Replacing out your chosen would be Chosen of Nurgle. Bestigors become Pestigors. For dragons, I would swap out the normal Chaos Dragon and give them a Toad Dragon, seeing as how it's one of the few unique ones in the entire setting. Bile Trolls to take out Chaos Trolls, Plague Ogres to take out Giants, and then the Knights Entropic if I'm really pushing my luck as a replacement of the Forsaken. It could give them a kind of cool high tier infantry unit option. Two things that I wouldn't change at all visually. The Chaos Sorcerers, I would just give them a lore of Nurgle and leave them alone visually, minimize the amount of work that we need to do here. And then for, your Marauders, your Chaos Spawn, your Warriors, all those kind of chafe units, I would just give them the Mark of Nurgle and give that to be a flat effect, whether that's, minus 15 speed, plus 25 armor, or, you know, pick your numbers as you will. But then that way they don't have to actually visually change that much while still giving the army a pretty dramatically different feeling. With that said, let's get started, and we will start with Norsca. If you're wondering why I'm picking Norsca of all factions to get a Monogon aligned theme, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here. The whole way that Norsca plays with, slowly building their allegiance towards one particular chaos god is incredibly inaccurate to their lore. It would have made a ton of sense with the Warriors of Chaos, perhaps, especially if you were building up your own one. But the way that they're put into the game makes absolutely zero sense. So, in general, most of the Norscan tribes don't change allegiances at all. If you're born into a Crow tribe, you stay a Crow tribe. If you're born into an Eagle tribe, you stay an Eagle tribe. That tends not to change. If you look at the two legendary lords they have too, they are both distinctly unaligned gods. Throg, you could potentially argue he's somewhat Korn-esque, but he actually doesn't serve any monogod. And Wulfric the Wanderer specifically is unaligned. Like there's just no two ways around that. So the way that their gameplay works has never ever ever made sense to me, and I'm a-okay with stripping that concept out. Instead, what I could see is potentially like a sort of appreciation by the various gods. If you're unaligned, you could get up to, say, level 3 with any of them without any of them locking you out. And if you picked a monogod army, you could not pick the other 3 gods. However, you could go up to a far greater bonus for that particular deity, right? So with that said, we'll get started into Norsca proper, but I kind of wanted to get that out of my system because it's going to come up with the simple fact that we are eschewing one of their gameplay concepts, but it's a gameplay concept that's always made absolutely no sense to me. All right, so with that rant out of the way, let's get started, I guess, like I said, with Norsca. So let's start with the legendary lord, Gutrot's Fume. He was himself a Norscan chieftain who was obsessed with monster hunts, which ties in perfectly to our gameplay considerations here. But unlike most marauders who are focused on hunting, things that they can actually fight on land, Gutrot was slightly deranged in the sense that he loved hunting sea creatures and would actually swim down to attack them. Ended up biting off a little more than he could chew the one time after he went after the Kraken and ended up getting his whole left side bitten off and being way too far down to survive. But, even despite being attacked and dying, he managed to try and kick his way up to the surface and survive. But the other Chaos Gods had all turned their back on him at this point in time for his failure. On the other hand, Nurgle thought it was crazy brave of him to even try that in the first place and decided to bless him as only Nurgle can. After that, of course, he became Monogon aligned only to Nurgle. Um, Ended up facing off against Karl Franz later on in the lore, ended up getting pushed back because he got ambushed by the Ice Queen at the same time he was trying to fight, but ended up surviving the conflict and still tried to, rebuild his armies and stuff. To put him into the game, I would have him lead the Rotblood tribe. Gonna steal this one from the modding community. And then I would change quite a few things around. So, for example, his Chaos Hounds, I would only give them the poison variant. I wouldn't even give them the standard one. I'd swap out the Frostworm for the Toad Dragon. Of course, all their Norse controls for the Bile Trolls. I'd swap out their Giants for Plague Ogres. I'd swap out their Marauder Chariots for Chariots of Nurgle. Of course, swapping out their Shaman Sorcerers of all the various types only to Sorcerers of Nurgle. And then, of course, swapping out their normal Chieftains to Putrid Blightlings. For the rest of their stuff, like Marauders and Femir, I would just give them all the Mark of Nurgle and leave them alone visually. However, things like the Skin Wolves and Mammoths, I would actually remove outright. And now that might seem incredibly damaging, but there is a method to my madness here. Skin Wolves are way too fast to be given high-end armor from Nurgle. Not to mention, as far as I'm aware in the lore, I've actually never seen that in the lore. They're not really a Nurgle military option. Mammoths, on the other hand, I would remove for the opposite reason. If you gave the mammoths the mark of Nurgle, they would be glacially slow. Like, you'd never actually get them into combat, although your opponent would have a damn annoying time getting rid of them too, which would also be somewhat annoying. If they were going to stay in the game, I'd give them the mark of Nurgle, but maybe a tuned one specific for mammoths, just because, like I said, I feel like they wouldn't be a particularly great addition to them. In terms of gameplay focus and stuff like that, they would sort of play like a monogod aligned Norscan faction, right? You would still be trying to conquer the Norths, convert everyone over to worshiping the Crow, except for you could get a lot more benefits from the Crow than what you could with any of the other factions. All right, moving over to the Beastmen. To start with, I had actually intended to make the Harbinger their legendary lord, but I think I'm going to pull a move from Sinch's book and change it over to Slugtongue. Slugtongue is actually somewhat sentient themselves. They are this rotting, putrid, disgusting creature who routinely gets people to sort of follow them and believe in them until they start to get hungry and starve. And when that happens, a new force comes in, wipes out the previous force that's just about to betray him, and the whole cycle continues anew. Um, in that sense, like I said, he's sort of sentient in the sense that he's always screwing over anyone who could potentially be a threat to him. From his Nurglish side, he is just a rotting mass of disgusting bugs and insects and everything like that. He is Nurglish, even if it's not explicitly stated. So with him being the leader, then what would we do for the armies? So there is a few things I would say right out of the gates. First things first, I would make it so that the Bray Shaman can only use the lore of Nurgle. I think that would help, incentivize them to stick with the Nurgle theme. Well, for the rest of the roster, I would pretty much just throw the mark of Nurgle on most things. You know, all of your gores on gores, Christ, pretty much everything. You just put a mark of Nurgle on them. If he's feeling particularly generous, hey, maybe we can get that Doom Bull in the game finally and put a mark of Nurgle on that. But if not, your Lord choice would of course be the Beast Lord with a mark of Nurgle, and then your heroes, as mentioned, Bray Shamans would only use mark of the lore of Nurgle, while the Doom or Gorbals would be given the mark of Nurgle themselves. I would take Harpies and Razor Gores completely out of their roster, as well as the default Warhounds. I would let the Warhounds be poison only. Um, for the Razor Gores that are missing, the Chariots, you could always put the Beasts of Nurgle back in, and frankly, you could put the Beasts of Nurgle back in general, and then put them on the chariot of Nurgle that way too. So you wouldn't actually have lost anything. Um, they're a bit more leashed back, especially considering I think Beastmen are predominantly played as a first strike kind of faction, and slowing them down and giving them a ton of armor kind of goes against how they play. Um, it would definitely be something that CA would have to take a look at and make sure that everything's good to go balance wise. But that could be a pretty interesting one too. If they're still a little underpowered, well then hey, throw a Toad Dragon in their lineup and let the chaos go. Alright, so for the Warriors of Chaos, I would pick Timirkhan to be their legendary lord. He is a pretty interesting fellow. I guess right off the bat, fellow's probably a poor way to describe him, concerning he is a bunch of maggots wearing a skin suit. As a result of that kind of makeup, he is almost impossible to properly kill. So, for example, he has been, decapitated and quote unquote killed tons of times, but all that managed to do was actually destroy the body he was in, while the maggots within him went out and reinfected a new host. If you've seen the strain, you are very familiar with what I'm talking about. Um, his most recent body is actually that of an ogre tyrant who had managed to rip him in half before he infected the ogre tyrant itself. And so not only does he now have the body of an ogre tyrant, but he also has a contingent of ogres as well. You could justify this by giving him a bonus to plague ogres of some kind or another. And the other thing that Timirkhan is famous for is his mount, which is Bubel Bolos, that word. Um, Basically, it is by far the most famous and most powerful of the toad dragons. So not only would that be a unique mount for him down the line, but also you could give him a bonus to toad dragons as well, thanks to his experience with using them. For his faction, I would out and out remove the Gorby's chariots, any cavalry to speak of, as well as the dragon ogres. And before you flip out at me that I've removed all of their high speed options, there is a method to my madness. Um, I would change out his Forsaken to Knights in Tropic. I would change out his normal Giants to Plague Ogres, as mentioned before. Normal Trolls to Bile Trolls. The Chaos Dragons to Toad Dragons, which would be kind of sucky because they can't fly, but still. I would change all of his chosen to chosen of Nurgle, and I would give them a bigger bonus as opposed to just the normal mark of Nurgle. Um, for a speedy option, I would give him chariots of Nurgle, as well as, yeah, no, for leader options, I would make the Putrid Blight Kings, and as before, all of the Marauders, Chaos Warriors, Chaos Spawn, and Hell Cannons, I would give them the mark of Nurgle. Again, this would make him a dramatically slower faction compared to everyone else, but that's very appropriate to Nurgle. Slow and steady is basically how they operate, right? Something else you could do, especially with, for example, some of the options that are present there, is because Nurgle tends to debuff your enemies. It's hard to fight when you've got flies flying into your face and chewing on your skin and stuff like that. As slow as they are and as vulnerable as they'd be to ranged weaponry, they wouldn't be caught, standing still, right? You can always throw some magic down to get rid of archers from completely obliterating your front lines. You can always use your chariots to try and harass people and stuff. And once it actually gets into combat, your enemy is dead. Um, so I think it would be sort of a self-balancing act. Um, for their gameplay focus, I mean, of course, Nurgle is Nurgle. However, Timurkhan is a lot more enthusiastic than Nurgle normally is, and has tried more than once to take over the world. As a result of that, I could see his faction actually being somewhat aggressive as far as Nurgle factions would go, which kind of slots in perfectly with the Chaos and Horde mechanics that we already have in there. As before, I would have him, you'd still have the normal Chaos corruption and the normal Horde mechanics of the Warriors of Chaos, as well as the plague spreading abilities that we mentioned before, but I would take it a step further too and make Timurkhan have 0 wound time as long as he wins the battle. So if someone kills your lord, as long as it's Timurkhan, as soon as that battle's over, you're right back on your feet again like nothing even happened. Alright, so you've all been waiting very patiently for this one, and it's finally here. This, of course, being the Demons of Chaos. I think that there is really, really only one option that stands above all others, that being Kugoth Plaguefather. If somehow you've missed this amazing, amazing GW creation, he is by far the most famous demon in all of Nurgle's demon armies. He is a mammoth, great unclean one. In fact, he is so fat he can no longer walk. He requires a palanquin just to move around. Um, he's so over the top. His actual end game goal is he is trying to poison all other gods of chaos. Let that sink in for a moment. This is a demon whose goal it is to try and find a guy like Korn, go up to him, and poison him to death. That's pretty amazing. In terms of gameplay, he is actually effectively an artillery platform, but a weird one that shoots Nurglings as ammunition. Now, I don't think there's a way to actually really properly represent that as the game currently works. What I could see happening is just treating him like a normal artillery platform, but with the ability to deploy a squad of Nurglings over at a location, limited to like 1 or 2 squads. And when deployed, he would lose the ability to fire for, I don't know, 20 seconds or so. Just that you couldn't tie someone up and bomb the crap out of them with Nurglings. I think it'd be a bit too overpowered. And of course, in close quarters combat, he is still just a massive, great unclean one, right? He'd still be a nightmare to take on up close. For the actual faction itself, I would strip away almost everything from the faction, but I would leave in the Chaos Beasts, Mutalith Vortex Beasts, Exalted Demons, and Dark Magisters, but I would tweak them all towards, Nurgleness. And then for everything else, I would swap in Plague Bearers, Poxbringers, which are a form of a herald, um, Plague Drones, of course, being your flying cavalry units, Nurglings, as well as Bubo, which are imps of Nurgle. So you'd have your flying, sort of replacement for Furies, although weaker ones. Rotflies, Pox Riders, which would be your cavalry units, Nurglings, which would be your tar pit, Beasts of Nurgle, as well as Chariots of Nurgle pulled by Beasts of Nurgle, and to round it all out, Toad Dragons. Those would be all of your main forces for your lords. I would do Great Unclean Ones and Demon Princes of Nurgle. And as I said in the Chaos Demons Undivided video, I would have them restricted behind rights or some sort of gameplay mechanic because, again, they are going to be phenomenally powerful compared to everyone else. You'll notice that in my Demons one, I actually gave them quite a lot of mobility options. I think more so compared to the rest of the race is the demons need a bit of mobility. A, the crumbling aspect is something that will literally take your army off the field if you're not prepared for it. And B, they don't really have any artillery options themselves outside of, Kugoth himself, which can only be in one army at a time. So unlike the other ones, which can still, put in some ranged options and stuff, the demons are kind of stuck just with what they've got available. But anyways, for the Demons of Chaos, it would be exactly what I said Kugoth's goal is. He would go through, find a particular faction serving one of those four chaos, or one of the other three enemy chaos gods, I should say, and poison them. And I think that that would be an amazing way to try and play him as. Anyways, it's going to wrap it up for this particular video. Did you agree with my picks? Would you have picked different legendary lords? Would you have thrown out my concept altogether and done something completely different? Let me know down in the comments and I'll answer you all as soon as I can get to each one of you. As I did say, each of these Demons of Chaos sort of, or I guess monogod videos, they do take a ton of time to do, so I probably won't touch on another one for about a month or so yet. But we'll stick to our normal release schedule in the meantime. So at the end of the week, we'll be taking a look at Shaky Rivers the Grim, part of his Old vs. New series. And next week, we'll be taking a look at Araby and what needs to happen in Total Warhammer 2 to get them thrown in. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.